My name is Jackie B. I am an alcoholic and a member from San Francisco. I also serve as the 2022 chair for the AA History Symposium, which is an annual, well, it happens every 2 years, Alcoholics Anonymous conference that creates an intimate environment for folks to get together and talk about AA history. We're postponing this year's conference to January, the end of January 2022. It takes place in Los Gatos, California, and please feel free to go to aahistorysymposium.org if you want to learn more about it. But thank you all for being here. This panel discussion It Came From Our Past, the history panel. We have three authors speaking today. Chris Finan has written, among other things, Drunks, you can see it right behind me, Drunks, The Story of Alcoholism and the Birth of Recovery. Bob Kay is the author of Keep Players in AA History. And William Schaberg is the author of the 2019 Writing the Big Book, The Creation of AA. When we're done, if there is time for questions and comments, I will invite you to participate. But right now, we're going to start with, I believe Chris is first. And so I'm really honored to introduce Chris Finan, again, who is the author of Drunks, The Story of Alcoholism, and the Birth of Recovery movement. So, Chris, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you for chairing, and also thanks to Joe C. for all the hard work putting this together. I was fortunate to meet Joe at the convention in 2018 in Toronto, and he is a ball of fire for sure. And I'm very pleased to be giving my first book talk on Zoom. Has certain advantages. I get to wear sweatpants, and that's nice. And I get to see some faces, and this is a nice sized crowd for, based on my experience with my book. But and I'm pleased to be with Bob and Jim as well, who I know. I thought that in 15 minutes, the best way to kind of summarize my book and my experience is to talk about the importance of the relationship of one alcoholic to another, one drunk talking to another. It is a theme that runs from the very beginning of recovery, which I think I would date from the last year of the 18th century, from 1799, obviously, to today and onward. And the relationship of alcoholic to alcoholic has been very important for me. And in my recovery, I am an alcoholic. And there were three stories that were told to me that were very important by alcoholics, that were very important for me to come into the rooms. One was the story my father told me, and I mentioned this in the book. My father, from a very early age, my early age, was telling me about the history of my family and the damage that alcoholism had done, at least as far back as his grandfather, and warning me that this was something that was in our heredity and that was affecting him as well. He started these stories when he was still drinking. He did stop. And about 5 years after he stopped, I stopped. The second story I heard was from a woman who came to 12-step my mother. My father helped arrange this meeting, and I agreed to sit with my mom because I was very worried about her. Based on the experience of that meeting, she didn't help my mom too much at all, but a lot of what she said sunk in for me. And then the final story was the story that I heard at a meeting in the village, my first meeting at the village, which I almost missed. I walked by it because this was the mid-'80s and there were a bunch of people in punk hairdos standing out in front. I thought they were at a rock concert, but it was an AA meeting, and I went in and listened to a very shaky guy talk about addiction. He talked as much about drugs as he did about alcohol, but I felt a real kinship for him, and I've been in AA ever since. The historical story begins, as I say, in 1799, which is the year in which a Seneca Indian by the name of Handsome Lake experienced a mystical vision. He was very, very sick with alcohol poisoning. His relatives thought that he was on the verge of death. And as he lay on his bed, he was visited by three warriors who took him on a journey, a sky journey, to show him all the sins that the Great Spirit wanted to end. And one of those sins was the sin of alcohol, drinking alcohol. In one of the rooms or along the way, he saw alcoholics being forced to drink molten lead as a punishment for their abuse. And when he eventually came to, he told this story to his people and preached a religious revival, telling them in significant measure the importance of that the Great Spirit didn't want them to drink anymore. This was a message that he spread not only among the Seneca, but among the other five tribes of the Iroquois Nation, significantly sobering that nation. And it, of course, stunned the white settlers that surrounded. And one of them asked an Onondaga Indian why suddenly they had been able to stop drinking after certainly they had been told often enough that drinking was their doom. And he said that they had no power, but when the Great Spirit forbids such conduct by their prophet, meaning Handsome Lake, he gave them the power to comply. So what Handsome Lake's message to his people was that they didn't have to drink. It was not ordained that they should drink, and this was something that they took for granted that before that if it existed, it was because the Great Spirit wanted them to have it. And Handsome Lake preached this gospel of sobriety for the next 15 years. He traveled almost exclusively on foot from village to village, delivering this message, and died sober in 1815. The next stage of the history begins 25 years later in Baltimore, when a small group of drinkers, after hearing a temperance drinker, for temperance was a major crusade around the nation at the time, decided that they would start their own temperance society, which became the Washingtonian Society. And this was a very different kind of temperance than the kind of temperance that was being pushed around them. This was a temperance movement that was directed to people who were actually sick with alcoholism. And the Washingtonians met regularly. They told their stories. This was the first time that alcoholics stood publicly and told their story. And when the meeting was over, they went out and searched for people who needed help. The Washingtonians became a phenomenon. They became a huge national fad. They traveled and influenced people in almost every community in America. Americans who weren't alcoholic were just stunned that people that they had assumed were unclaimable, unsavable, were standing up in the gutter and becoming upright citizens. And for many years, for many years, the Washingtonians had an influence. Their influence began to fade almost as quickly as it arose, because that's the nature of fads. And ultimately, the society was disappeared. But it had an incredible influence on medical people, who for the first time saw that alcoholism wasn't was not a death sentence, that it was something that could be treated. And the beginning of treatment really starts, in the wake of the Washingtonian movement. And then the final example I thought that impressed me so much in my research was the story of the Keeley cure. It was also called the Keeley gold cure because it supposedly had gold in it. Actually, it started to have gold in it. Dr. Keeley tried it on the first person and almost killed him. So he took the gold out at that point, but continued to call it the gold cure. It was a shot that was administered in over 100 clinics around the country in the 1890s. And people would go to these locations, these clinics, and many of them were residential. And the alcoholics spent as much as 3 weeks together, 21 days, our equivalent of 21 days. And 4 times a day, they took a shot, and they drank an extra elixir, and supposedly at the end of that, they would be sober, cured, not have to worry about alcoholism ever again. Well, as you know, the cure was not a cure at all. What cured the men was the exposure to other alcoholics, the opportunity that they had between shots to sit with each other and talk about their experience, to see that they weren't alone. And they drew strength from those relationships that they carried back to their homes. They established a national Keeley League, not only in big cities like Chicago, but also in small towns, where they had, they often sent other people in their communities. They helped pay for other people in their communities to go to these clinics. So the story that we know so well today, the story of one alcoholic talking to another, is really well over a century old. By the time Bill and Dr. Bob came together, it was almost a forgotten history. Nobody really remembered the Keeley Institute. It was wiped out by the 1893 Depression, and the Keeley League eventually lapsed as well. But even Bill and Bob, so Bill and Bob had to discover it for themselves. And I think it's really interesting that they remembered their own first meeting very differently. That, as Bill told it, what really hit him hard, he was talking about Bob, was the medical business, the verdict of inevitable annihilation. In his memoirs, Bob said it wasn't anything like that. He said he was well aware of what the medical community said about alcoholism. And it was that, as he said, that he, meaning Bill, he was the first human being with whom I ever talked who knew what he was talking about in regard to alcoholism from actual experience. In other words, he talked my language. And I think that really neatly summarizes our experience today. We in AA, we speak each other's language. We not only know a lot about each other's experience, but we are able to communicate with each other all aspects of our existence and our lives, and to share and to draw on each other for help when we need it and to offer help when we can. And there are times when I wonder if I really need to go to AA. I've been sober a long time. Could I exist without it? My answer is that, yeah, maybe I could, but who would want to? And I think that's what keeps a lot of us coming back to the rooms and playing a part in the next person's recovery.
Hi, thank you so much. That was just incredible. And again, the book is Drunks. Drunks, The Story of Alcoholism and the Birth of Recovery. Thank you so much. And so our next speaker is someone I am so happy to consider a friend and a mentor and just a hell of a guy, and the author of this incredibly big book, this really, really big book called Writing the Big Book, The Creation of AA. And I am really pleased to introduce Bill S. William Schaberg.
Thank you, Jackie. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you again, Joe, for inviting me. And I really want to talk today. I spent 11 years researching that book, and my sweet spot is the early time of Alcoholics Anonymous. So I wanted to talk about some secular arguments that were offered in early Alcoholics Anonymous. And I've got three major players for that. First, we got Dr. William Silkworth. And, he rarely gets the emphasis he needs in this particular direction. Wilson said I'm going to read a bunch of things to you because I'm a believer in primary documents. That's what we do here for a living. So this is in a primary document. This is Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age. But Bill says this is his fullest rendition of this speech that Silkworth gave him when he was about 5 months sober. He says, "Look, Bill, you've had nothing but failure because you're preaching these alcoholics. You're talking to them about Oxford Group precepts of being absolutely honest, absolutely pure, absolutely unselfish, and absolutely loving. That's a very big order. Then you top it off by harping on this mysterious spiritual experience of yours. No wonder they point their finger at their heads and go out and get drunk. Why don't you turn your strategy the other way around? Aren't you the very fellow who once showed me the book by the psychologist William James, which says that deflation at great depth is the foundation of most spiritual experiences? Have you forgotten all about that? Have you forgotten that Dr. Carl Jung of Zurich told a certain alcoholic, the one who later helped sober up your friend Evie, that his only hope for salvation was a spiritual experience? No, Bill, you've got the cart before the horse. You've got to deflate these guys first. So give them the medical business and give it to them hard. Pour it on right into them about the obsession that condemns them to drink and the physical sensitivity or allergy of the body that condemns them to go mad or die if they keep on drinking. Coming from another alcoholic, one alcoholic talking to another, maybe that will crack those tough egos deep down. Only then can you begin to try out our other medicine, the ethical principles that you picked up from the Oxford Group." So, wow, there's a real in-your-face stand down, Bill Wilson, from all that God stuff. It's really what he was doing. Now, Silkworth wrote an article 2 years later that was published in June in a medical journal, and it was called The Reclamation of the Alcoholic. And in that, he talked about moral psychology being the thing that is the key thing for these people to stop drinking. And by the way, if you've read the doctor's opinion closely, there are two mentions in the doctor's opinion of moral psychology, but with absolutely no explanation of what he's talking about in the book. The first one's on page 27, Roman numeral. "We doctors have realized for a long time that some form of moral psychology was the utmost importance to alcoholics." And then later on page 31, he says, "His alcoholic problem was so complex and his depression so great that we felt his only hope would be through what we then called moral psychology, and we doubted if even that would have any effect." So in this article in 1937, which is almost 2 years before the book comes out, he's talking about moral psychology being the salvation for alcoholics. And he says, the patient knows he has reached the lasting conclusion and experiences a great sense of relief. These are people that he's treating in the hospital. These individuals, Silver says introverts for the most part. That has not been my experience with alcoholics, but we'll go past that. These individuals, introverts for the most part, whose interests center entirely in themselves, well, that sounds right to me, once they had made their decision, frequently asked how they could help others. So here's the essence of moral psychology, is getting out of yourself. Selfishness, self-centeredness, that we thought was the root of our problem, and paying attention and becoming useful to other people. Then he's got these two cases, Hank Parkhurst and Bill Wilson, and he says, in both cases, he took up moral psychology and he's been staying sober ever since. So Silberg was really making serious secular arguments for an approach to sobriety. So we got three players here. The next big player is my personal hero, Jimmy Burwell. Jimmy Burwell came into Alcoholics Anonymous first on January 8th, 1938. He was a real disruptive force in the New York group. He was an avowed and very outspoken atheist. He drank again on June 11th, 1938. He only lasted a week. He comes back on June 18th of 1938 and stays continuously sober until September 8th of 1974. This is a success story, folks, a big success story. Now, I found in the archive in Stepping Stones, there was a handwritten story by Bill Wilson called Jimmy. And it was written probably after the big book was published, but just a couple of years. And I'm just going to read the first couple of paragraphs of this. I love this story. I love Jim Burwell. He's such a cool guy. So the title is Jimmy. Like a 4-ton bomb, the new member exploded among our small group. As we were then very young, no one had ever seen anybody like Jimmy. Jimmy knew just what he was after. He wanted to stop drinking. There was no doubt about it. Enthusiastic, sincere, aggressive. He was all of these. But Jimmy was a man of fixed ideas, very fixed, as we soon discovered. Rising to his feet at a meeting, Jimmy stridently declared, "Damn this God business, it's the bunk. I don't need it to make this program work, and neither does anybody else. It's a lot of superstition. We ought to stand on our own feet, get honest, and work with other alkies. That's program enough. Let's skip the God stuff." And then Wilson says, and so the trouble began. So, yeah, early trouble about the God stuff. My third player, Hank Parkhurst. If you read the book, Hank Parkhurst is the forgotten co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he is, after Bill Wilson, the hero of my book, writing the big book, The Creation of AA. Parkhurst was a man who was theologically challenged, shall we say. It's hard to pin down exactly what Hank Parkhurst thought at any given time. Like most of us, he changed his religious beliefs over time. So when he first came in, he was gung-ho with the Oxford group. There's a letter he wrote to Sam Shoemaker in the archives that's just amazing. Hank had a plan for taking over the world with the Oxford group in January of 1935. I mean, he was just ready to go. You know, he was always had these big plans. But what Hank wanted was, when he really wanted a book, he was really pushing for a book from the early days on, and he wanted a book that was psychologically oriented. So Wilson finally starts writing the book on May 20th, 1938, and a couple of weeks later, he starts writing, first he writes his own story, and then he starts writing There Is a Solution. He's just going to write 2 chapters in this opening salvo of writing. And as he's writing this chapter, There Is a Solution, Hank handwrites out 11 pages and gives him to Bill. And Bill writes at the bottom, Hank's ideas. These are Hank's ideas. And I just got to read, again, some of this stuff. I think it's just wonderful. This is Hank Parkhurst in June of 1938. If you don't know, the book was published in April of 1939. So we're a little ways out. Parkhurst writes to Bill Wilson. One of the easiest and the most talked about of things among us is the religious experience. I believe that this is incomprehensible to most people. Simple and meaningful words to us, but meaningless to most of the people we are trying to get this over to. in my mind, religious experience, religion, etc., should not be brought in. We are actually irreligious, but we are trying to be helpful. We have learned to be quiet, to be more truthful, to be more honest, to try to be more unselfish, to make the other fellow's troubles our troubles. And by following 4 steps, most of us have a religious experience. The fellowship, the unselfishness appeals to us. I wonder, he says to Wilson, if we are off track. Man, I just love this. I mean, so you're talking about we are trying to be helpful, quiet, truthful, honest, unselfish, to make the other fellow's troubles our troubles. That sounds to me exactly like Dr. William D. Silkworth's moral psychology. What Hank Parkhurst is selling to Bill Wilson is the message he's been hearing from Dr. Silkworth, and Bill's been hearing from Dr. Silkworth, but Bill's leaning more on his white light experience, and that was Bill Wilson's experience. You can't walk away from personal experience like that, and Bill Wilson did. So Parkhurst is always he's doing this rear guard action, trying to get Wilson to tone the book down. And I got to tell you, one of the shocking things to me was the first time I saw a typed up version of "There Is a Solution." In the beginning, you know, the famous story where Roland Hazard goes to see Dr. Young, and Young says, you know, you need to have a vital spiritual experience. I think those are the 3 most important books, could be the 3 most important words in the entire book. But when Wilson wrote the story first in June of 1938, what Jung told Roland Hazard was that you needed to have a vital religious experience. Whoa, really? A vital religious experience? Man, oh man. So I got no direct evidence that Hank Parkhurst got him to tone that thing down. But if I knew that somebody had some proof before I looked at it, I'd make a $5,000 bet that Hank Parkhurst was responsible for that. Parkhurst goes on with this. I mean, he's doing this rear guard action on Bill Wilson because Bill's just churning out these chapters. And so in November of 1938, he writes to employers, which, by the way, is the only chapter without any mention of the word spiritual or the word God in the entire book. So he was applying his own criteria, his own yardstick, his own principles to this chapter when he wrote it. He stayed right away from that. And, you know, sometime around the same time, probably in November of 38, he writes a proposed chapter that he gives to Bill Wilson called the Q&A chapter. And the Q&A chapter is made up of 94 different questions and answers that he's proposing. It's an amazing snapshot of Alcoholics Anonymous in New York City in November of 1939 from this one man's perspective. Now, Parkhurst was just a terrible writer. He was just dreadful. And these 15 type pages, which are in the GSO archive in New York City, or in the appendix in the back of my book, are just amazing. They're just amazing. So I got to read you a couple of these things real quick. One of the questions is, how often do you pray? And Parkhurst says, many times a day. What is your prayer? Parkhurst says, thy will be done, and mean it, which is an interesting sidestep, I think, on the entire supreme being thing. And then somebody says to him, one of the questions, isn't this nothing more or less than old-fashioned revivalism? And Hank says, I'm forced to say, so what? It works. There is nothing that could place me in a more untenable position or make me do more ridiculous things than I did when in the grip of uncontrolled drinking. Amen to that. And then scattered throughout, he makes a couple of comments about his own belief system. This is in November of 38 when he's writing this. He said, I believe some power outside of me has straightened my thinking in regard to the inevitable results of one drink. And then somewhere else he says, to keep first things first, of course, that means for me to keep a proper relation with the power that enabled me to recover. He's got no description of the power in either one of those. Then he says, I understand God to be a great, indefinable, unexplainable power, which will help me if I would keep in tune with it. So Parkhurst is doing this stuff. The real arguments start, though, when Bill Wilson writes the 12 steps in the first week of December 1938. Now everything else he had written was kind of this is my explanation of what alcoholism is. Now it's his explanation of how to get out of the problem, how to solve the problem. And Hank's arguing for a psychological book. Fitz Mayo, the second guy who got sober in New York City immediately after Hank Parkhurst, is arguing for an explicitly religious book. And Hank Parkhurst, he just wipes the floor with Fitz Mayo. Poor Fitz, I feel bad for him. That was just, I would feel bad for anybody getting in an argument with Hank Parkhurst, to tell you the truth. He was a super salesman of the number one order. But Hank's suggestions are that Wilson needs to tone it down by putting in things like higher power and power greater than ourselves and God as we understand him. So, I know we talked about Jimmy Burwell. I know Burwell's always claimed credit for single-handedly getting God as we understand him into the steps. I think he was very instrumental in doing that, but the story's much more complicated. Wilson had used that phrase when he wrote his own story in late May of 1938. And but at the time that Parkhurst was going in and arguing with Bill Wilson so vehemently about all this stuff, Jimmy Burwell was living. So Jimmy'd been living with him for months at that point. And I think Burwell was just cranking Parkhurst up and sending him in to fight with Bill Wilson. And I think one of the arguments he won was God as we understood him, which is the only way I ever would have personally come into Alcoholics Anonymous and stayed sober. Okay, maybe not last, but if you go to page 12 of the big book, this is Hank Parkhurst's contribution, again, his rear guard action against Bill Wilson. You go to page 12 of the big book of Bill's story, and there's 4 paragraphs that start with, despite the living example, and it ends with, of course I would. Hank Parkhurst wrote those 4 paragraphs and inserted them into Bill's story between the time they published the original multilith copy, the pre-publication copy of the big book in February of 1939, and when it was actually published in April, a couple of months later. And Hank's, you can look at the book that started it all, published by Hazelton, which is a facsimile of the multilith copy where Hank Parkhurst recorded all the suggestions for changes, some of which they took, some of which they didn't. But he wrote in that book these 4 paragraphs. And these 4 paragraphs, in the middle it says, for instance, my friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, why don't you choose your own conception of God? And as we're going to hear from Bob Kay, as Bob Kay mentions when he deals with this story in his book, he says, did Ebby ever say that? And he's like, no, I don't think so. It doesn't fit anything like the Oxford group. It was just, but it's what Hank wanted. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more is required of me to make a beginning. In my opinion, that is pure Hank Parkhurst. And last but not least, we got Hank and Bill and Ruth Hawk and Dorothy Schneider up in Cornwall, and they're working with the printer. They're taking proofs and they're correcting the proofs on the spot. This is the final version, the final corrections made to the big book. And Dorothy, we have this great interview with Dorothy Schneider from 1954, where she says, Bill, I can still see you, and I can see Hank just pounding on you to make changes, and you saying, well, I don't want this thing to be as wishy-washy so that nobody will get sober, for God's sakes, So Parkhurst was relentless. He just never, ever gave up trying to drive this in the direction of moral psychology. And I am eternally grateful for Hank Parkhurst and all the changes he made to our big book. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. And that's wonderful. I could listen to Bill speak for hours about the big book and AA history. But again, the book is available as an ebook. The appendices are amazing. I heard that it might be available as an audiobook now too. So, and last panelist, I'm honored to have Bob Kay speak, and he's the author of this wonderful book, Key Players in AA History. And I think it's time for a second edition, Bob. And yeah, I'll turn it over. Oh, also, if you have any questions, we may only have time for 1 or 2, but if you do have questions for a panelist, send them to me in a private message. I'm under #Q&A now, and I will pick some questions to ask at the end of the meeting.
My name is Bob. I'm an alcoholic, and I'm very honored to be on this panel. I'm not sure I qualify to be here, but I read Chris's book shortly after it came out, and 2 pages in, I said, this guy is a magnificent writer, which he is, a beautifully written book. And I've done a lot of research in the period his book covers, and I learned a lot of stuff from it. So, tremendous book. Bill Schaberg's book, I read that before it was released and did a glowing book review for aagnostica.org. And I say without fear of contradiction, Bill's book is the most important book in AA in the last 40 years. So it's pretty thrilling to be here. I'm here because Joe C. thought I would get a kick out of it, I think, and he's right. And, and he wanted me to talk about Richard Peabody because he's obsessed with Richard Peabody. So I'm going to talk about Richard Peabody. And a very smart friend of mine in Pittsburgh who went to Boston College says, don't pronounce it Peabody, you'll sound like a rube, and it's Peabody and all this stuff. And I was rehearsing Peabody, and I decided I can't do that. And then I was thinking one day, the other day, I said, I live 6 miles from downtown Oshawa. I am a rube, so we're going to go with the Peabody thing. And so a nervous Canadian could do worse in a history presentation than to start with a quotation from Ernie Kurtz. So I'm going to do that. And Ernie wrote, Alcoholics Anonymous was not the only therapy for alcoholics. It flourished in its time. Other approaches to treating alcoholism, though they derive from sources very different from the influence that impinged upon AA, used similar methods and even incorporated some of the ideas that a forgetfulness of history leads later thinkers to associate with Alcoholics Anonymous. In particular, the approach of Richard R. Peabody not only preceded Wilson's own sobriety, but well into the 1950s was accepted and endorsed much more enthusiastically than was Alcoholics Anonymous. And, I'm not here to say anything against Alcoholics Anonymous. I've sober a long time for conventional AA. My late father got sober in 1961, so my family is very indebted to Alcoholics Anonymous, and I have no major gripe. I love that we're becoming a secular option so that people like me would have a little easier time than when I came in 1991. But anyway, did Bill Wilson, was he aware of this Peabody's book? Peabody wrote a book in 1931 called The Common Sense of Drinking, and there's a copy of that book in the AA archives, and it contains this inscription in part. Dr. Peabody was, as far as it is known, the first authority to state once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic, and he proved it by returning to drinking. And he probably did. He was probably drinking at the end, but it's just kind of a rumor, unconfirmed. His wife wouldn't comment on it, and some other people said he had a heart attack, etc. But he was sober about 14 years. He worked as a lay therapist, helping people to get sober for fee basis, so it's sort of sponsoring for money. But anyway, the Big Book Story, A Man of 30, illustrates the point of once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. After quitting drinking for 25 years to accumulate a fortune, the man returns to drinking. The results are disastrous. So many think this tale is an exaggerated version of a similar story in The Common Sense of Drinking, and I can't prove that, but I don't see any other real logical theories, and it fits, a lot of us, even before Bill's fine book, knew Bill Wilson was a bit of an exaggerator, and if somebody could stay sober 5 years, then 25 years was even more impressive that they'd go back to drinking and have the same problem. So anyway, Peabody wrote, Suffice it to say, once a drunkard, always a drunkard, or a teetotaler. A fairly exhaustive inquiry has elicited no exception to this rule. So Peabody was aware of the need for people like us to embrace total abstinence, and that wasn't totally known through society. Even the medical people weren't all convinced of that. But and Peabody had a non-spiritual approach. Did that non-spiritual method work? Well, Marty Mann wrote, the Peabody method was effective with a considerable number of alcoholics. It is still effective today, as of 1950, when she was writing this, with some alcoholics. And were these real alcoholics? That's a real buzz thing in the fundamentalist land. You sober atheists can't be real alcoholics. But it seems like they were. Peabody identifies hard drinkers as heavy drinkers who are not compelled the next morning and doesn't place them in the category of real alcoholics. So his category of a real alcoholic is probably stronger than what A's is. Pass It On says Peabody, a recovered alcoholic himself, had recently died after a short but successful career as an independent lay therapist, helping alcoholics on a fee basis. So Bill Wilson was known to be very generous in sharing credit for the founding and contributions to AA to almost anyone who, as long as they didn't have the first name of Clarence. You know, Clarence Snyder, Bill and him didn't get along too well. But the notable exceptions are Frank Buckman and Richard Peabody. The rumor that Peabody had been drinking prior to his premature death at 44 in 1936 was credible enough for most AA members. The other problem in citing Peabody as an influencer is that his approach was entirely secular, the antithesis of what Bill and Hank were selling. So doubtless they had no interest in writing, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism, except that it seems to have worked for Richard Peabody and many of his patients. And Richard Peabody was born in 1892. He's about 2 or 3 years older than Bill Wilson, and he was born into an elite family in Boston. His great-great-grandfather made megabucks back then in the shipping business, and he imported to the United States pepper from Sumatra and opium from East Asia. Now, maybe I should be saying he imported outside issues from East Asia. I was in a more politically correct meeting. But so anyway, Richard Peabody had every advantage. He went to Groton Private School, and then he went on to Harvard, where he had problems because he had started drinking and he didn't graduate at Harvard. And anyway, by the age of 30, he had experienced depression, divorce, disinheritance, and institutionalization. And he sought sobriety at the Emmanuel Church in Boston with quite an amount of desperation, it seems. The progressive ministers there had PhDs in psychology, and they were having success with alcoholics in a clinic they were running, and they were combining religious methods with psychological techniques. And one of their successful reformations was Courtney Baylor, and he began working for them as a paid counselor probably in 1913. And he had two famous clients. One was Richard Peabody, and the other one was Roland Hazard of Big Book fame. So William White suggests that he was America's first lay therapist in the field of alcoholism. And by 1924, Peabody was in private practice himself, having gotten sober in probably 1922. And he offered his plan of sobriety to the well-heeled. He took a lot from the Emmanuel movement and Courtney Baylor, and he secularized the whole process. There was no more praying or any of that stuff. And in 1931, he produced a book called The Common Sense of Drinking. And the most obvious Bill Wilson cribbing from the Peabody book is seen in chapter 5 of the big book. Half measures availed us nothing. So 8 years earlier, Peabody had written halfway measures are of no avail. So it's almost unchanged. So I'm just going to give in a few other Peabody lines that I thought ring a bell for AA people. And I put a title on them rather. I don't have enough time to give you AA quotes to match. But just regarding anonymity, the patient's private affairs can be told to no one without his permission. Delusional thinking. He casts longing looks at a successful career of hard but controlled drinking. Denial. We talk about denial. The subject of a case study reports, at times I will think up the queerest systems of reasoning rather than admit I am licked. And immaturity. Alcoholism is a disease of immaturity, regardless of the actual age of the patient suffering from it. And self-diagnosis. Whether he wants to stop drinking or not is most decidedly his own business. If a person thinks he can drink, let him continue to do so. Honesty. The alcoholic must be absolutely honest in giving an account of his thoughts and actions, and he must take precautions against lying ingenuously to himself. Obsession. The alcoholic is often motivated by inner forces of which he is unaware and over which, without scientific assistance, he has no substantial control. So that's scientific assistance. We're kind of into the realm of moral psychology. A lot of us think AA works more on psychology than it does on moral. I believe that William James talked about religio-mania, and mania is enthusiasm. And I've seen people get very enthusiastic about God or AA or whatever, and that helps them. And, the mania is more important than the specifics of any kind of religio, because I don't have any of that. So willpower. Willpower rarely has anything to do with abstinence. Insanity. It seems hard to believe that an otherwise sane person will deliberately ruin his life against his own best judgment for the sake of an immature form of enjoyment, unless he is motivated by a strong, compelling force of which he is unaware and from which he is times trying to escape. So there's others. I'm going to skip some of this stuff. Mel B, and I've read a lot of AA history books, and Mel B was a big guy, stayed sober a zillion years, and he wrote a book called New Wine, The Spiritual Roots of the 12-Step Miracle. And I wanted to quote that book because I was hoping John Huey might be listening, and I thought the word miracle might give him a heart attack, but we have a little kind of fun thing going on. So one of the most intriguing coincidences in AA history, although it is never mentioned, is that Bill and Lois Wilson attended Calvary Church Oxford group meetings while Richard Peabody was treating clients less than a block away at Gramercy Park. Peabody had shifted his business from Boston to New York, probably because there's more rich people there. He was getting like $20 an hour for private sessions at a time when money was maybe 20 times more valuable per dollar than today. But anyway, Peabody helped to educate a generation of medical doctors about the hopelessness of the alcoholic's condition, and he trained other alcoholics to carry on the same work. So there were a bunch of Peabody clients who became therapists, so it spread to a certain level that it was never going to be like AA because it was never going to be free. And this one of the tremendous things about Alcoholics Anonymous. One thing, it's ubiquitous, it's all over the place. There's meetings everywhere, and it's free. But anyway, as the medical community gained strength and respect of the public more through the 40s and 50s, there was abundant pressure put on these unlicensed therapists to kind of be practicing some version of medicine. And mid-50s was kind of the end of the Peabody movement. But It lasted a while, and they definitely helped some alcoholics to get sober. And the religious element of AA may see lay therapists' lack of spirituality as the drawback. Our crowd today is more likely to see the lack of fellowship, and nevertheless, with neither spirituality nor fellowship, Richard Peabody and Peabodyism brought sobriety to a considerable number of alcoholics, real alcoholics. Of course, a further drawback is that the therapy was far from free. I'll end with a quote with another of my mentors, William L. White, and he wrote, "Peabody's teachings significantly influenced the evolution of alcoholism treatment in the years that preceded and followed the origin of Alcoholics Anonymous." Anyway, thanks very much, and it was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Bob and everyone. I'm just interrupting for a moment with a brief announcement. The after party, which was scheduled for here to begin at 4 o'clock, is being moved to the Oh My God room, which, if you didn't know, stands for Our Mostly Agnostic Group of Drunks. It's from the Orlando group. And everyone here, once we're finished with this panel, is welcome to join us over there. We have the Hank Parkhurst Blackout Players debuting a comedy skit. We've got stand-up comic Dave from Kansas City, We Agnostics, co-hosting that with us. And then once all of that's done, there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. So that means that if you do have questions, you guys can run a little bit late here. If people want to hang back, don't take advantage of them. And those who want to head over to the after party at 4 o'clock, the information I've just posted in the chat, and it's right in the program, the Oh My God room. So back over to you, Jackie, and thanks everybody for participating.
All right. So I received some questions, and I hope I didn't get a chance to ask Bob, but Bob, give me a thumbs up if you can stick around for some questions for about 15 minutes or so. Is that a thumbs up? Yes. Okay. So our panelists have agreed to stick around just a little longer. So I'm going to, again, if you want, you can go to the other room, but you can stay here for the question and answer. So I'm just going to ask some questions that I've received. Okay. And also I just wanted to clarify, again, this is Bob's book, and thank you so much, Bob. And again, I did want to clarify, because it has been asked and clarified, that all three of these books are not AA conference approved literature. They're published by different organizations, or self-published, etc., by, as we all know, or many hope to know, that AA conference approved does not mean disapproved. It just means that it's not published by AAWS. But they're all wonderful history books, and we can avail ourselves of all kinds of literature. So the first question is, let's see. So the first question someone had was about how the different panelists feel about when members identify themselves. I'm not sure if this is really a history question, but if you have any history insights, you can, how they feel about atheists and agnostics who identify themselves as such during AA meetings, and what your thoughts are on that. So if you have any thoughts about members who identify at group level as atheists and agnostics, whether to help others, etc., please share your experience. And you can just unmute yourself and share.
I've been identifying as an atheist agnostic, as a non-believer in Alcoholics Anonymous meetings continuously for 39 years on Tuesday. And I've always been very grateful for the acceptance I've gotten in the groups that I went to. There have been groups that I don't go to anymore where you don't get that kind of acceptance. Fortunately, I live in an area where there's Connecticut's got over 2,500 meetings a week. So there's no excuse for me to be going someplace that makes me uncomfortable, and I don't do that.
Yeah. Anyone else? Chris or Bob K?
Hi there. I find for myself there the last 3 months I attend the treatment center that I went to 4 years ago. They have alumni Zoom meetings, and a number of those people that are in there, they don't connect with the higher power, but I like this idea of moral psychology. And we were able to talk and share and pass on information. Some of them were interested in coming into this conference today. And that was really quite freeing, because when I started in 87, I was that minority in a minority in a minority. It's a good thing I took some psychology a year or two before I started therapy, because I relied a lot on that to get a lot of support, but also with people too. So it's been a nice positive event to be in the alumni group and being able to share and then not squelching me and say, don't talk about this stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. Sorry. So I'm sorry to make that not clear, although I do appreciate that. We're just taking questions and answers for the three panelists currently. So Bob, do you have any thoughts on that? You can unmute yourself, Bob.
Yeah, so I don't walk into AA meetings and say, my name is Bob, I'm an alcoholic and a grumpy atheist. But within my area, to be clear, I express that. And, you know, I didn't have a late life conversion to atheism. I kind of shifted at the University of Toronto 50 years ago. So I came into AA an atheist. I've never hidden that. And I use a certain amount of diplomacy. I tell people, you know, there are two Toronto area atheists that speak a lot of conventional meetings. And one is me and one is Joe C. And I think it's because we do it with a certain amount of diplomacy and we don't bring our boxing gloves. But I try to carry a message to new people that there are other ways to work the steps and get benefits of it other than, you know, strictly as written.
Thank you. Chris, do you want to add anything?
Well, I live in New York City, so the meetings are very secular, actually. There are occasionally people who identify themselves as real alcoholics. Haven't met any recently, but if I hear somebody struggling with the God stuff, I often do, you know, identify as an atheist and say that what my father said to me, who was a red-faced atheist, you know, this is a hoop you can jump through.
Thank you. Okay, so let's see. Now we have a question from Angela. Any thoughts on making this history part of AA culture? For example, currently, if you bring up Hank in a meeting, most people will say who, but they know how to quote the 12 and 12, etc. So what are your thoughts about maybe how do we expand, it sounds like, the knowledge of AA history and these other key players among AA mainstream or AA culture in general? Maybe we can start with Bill on that, since.
Well, it's, you know, I really had no idea what the initial reaction to my book was going to be. I mean, one of the things it does is it completely dials back the contributions almost zero from Akron in relation to the writing of the book. And of course, I really thought they were going to take 20 copies of the book and burn them in a pile on the front of Dr. Bob's lawn. But I haven't really heard a lot of negative stuff yet. But you know, in any society, in any culture, it takes time for things to weave their way into the grassroots level. So the book's been selling well. We've been through 3 printings in the first year, so I'm really happy about that. And if it keeps being read and talked about, then I think some of these stories that have been accepted for decades that are just really not accurate are going to start fading, hopefully.
Do any of our other panelists have a thought? Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, so I have a genius younger brother who's a financial wizard. He was vice president of KPMG, big chartered accountant company. And so he said to me in 2015 when I was publishing my book, he says, "So you're publishing a book about AA history?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "The main market for that is AA members." I said, "Yeah. And they won't sell your book at 99.9% of AA meetings. Is that your genius business plan?" And so it's frustrating. Those of us that have written specialty books, for most of us, the sales are limited. I've been fairly pleased, at least to get up into the 4 digits. But yeah, there's never been a better time. I mean, we have AA Agnostic, a website. We have AA Beyond Belief. We have Rebellion Dogs. We have a lot of books being published, and some of them are getting out there. And the average AA member isn't all that interested in history. He's just happy to hear something at another meeting and then repeat it. And by the time that goes 4 times, it all gets butchered. So a friend of mine, the guy in Pittsburgh, he said, anything you hear about history in an AA meeting is probably wrong. And I don't think he misassessed that.
And Chris, do you want to add anything?
Well, I write history, in other subjects as well, and we're not a people. The American people are not great history readers, so I'm not surprised that there isn't more knowledge among AA members. History really only comes up when we do a traditions meeting, and I'm glad we in my group we do that so that they get some sense of where this all came from.
Thank you. Okay, another question that I received was, as this is an international conference, where was the rest of the world during the early development of AA? I almost feel like, Chris, you might have a hand at being able to answer this, since do you know anything about international recovery attempts prior to, or was it really a North American and as you mentioned also the indigenous roots of it? But
in this respect, I think America did lead the way, and AA led the way. There was certainly a temperance movement outside of the United States, and in England in particular, in Ireland as well. So there were important movements for sobriety, but they weren't necessarily focused on alcoholics.
Okay. Bob or Bill, do you know anything else about what was going on in the rest of the world?
Well, Ernie Kurtz used to pound on me all the time when I would talk to him that whatever I was doing, I had to understand the context. And, the context of the whole temperance movement in the United States and outside the United States, but mainly in the United States, is just an amazing thing that culminates in Prohibition. 1919, bang, no more booze in the United States of America. And the effects of that on the culture of the country, on lawlessness, for instance, drove John D. Rockefeller Jr., one of his biggest supporters of Prohibition, away from Prohibition. So we get to 1932, they give up Prohibition, and they've been trying to cure drunkenness for like 75 years. There's been this huge push in America to get people away from booze, and then it culminates in Prohibition, and it's a disaster. So they got nothing. They got absolutely nothing in 1932 when Prohibition goes away. So Wilson coming along 2 years later, he's in a sweet spot. He's in a sweet spot where people they're still looking for a solution to alcoholism, and he comes along with one that fits right into the religious bent of the culture of those days. And I think that's one of the reasons that Alcoholics Anonymous was as successful as it was, because it came at the right time. I used to tell my sponsor when I first got sober that I thought AA couldn't have come along until the telephone was invented, because if you can't call your sponsor, there's not a good chance of you staying sober. I don't know how true that is, but it certainly was helpful to me. Thank you.
And I don't know if Bob, you have anything you know about stuff happening outside of North America?
the history of like alcohol problems been around a long time, and the medical people got frustrated. They've done very poorly, and they were content to turn it over to the religious people who didn't give up as easily. But there's a road to prohibition, and that's about a 100-year pathway. And the alcohol problems were going to end because there was going to be no alcohol. Well, that turned into a complete joke. But AA has had some tremendous success, and whatever the percentages are, just about everything earlier wasn't good. And those groups like Washingtonians and the Keeley Goal Cure, they had Keeley clubs where people that graduated, they would gather together because, we need more than a week detox or a month of treatment and go just not drink and live happily ever after. And for some reason, the best thing that's worked in history is when we get together and help each other. And those have worked, and most of those groups blew apart because of outside issues and getting, going beyond their scope and trying to get involved in political stuff. But so AA's been a win on that, and 90 years kind of we've been going. It's getting to be pretty impressive. So thanks. Or 81 years, 85.
We have about 4 more minutes, and I believe, Annette, you got to ask your question and get some help in the main chat. I think we can take either a few comments or a few questions using the blue hand to raise your hand, and then we're going to end in just, we can take 1 or 2 only because we do want to make sure that people head over to the Oh My God room to check out the entertainment and to find out whether Jackie B in the play is Jackie B the host, which would be funny. Okay. So I will ask a question, and I guess, the question I have is actually inspired by the talk that was given at the Outside the Kitchen Table talk, which was an earlier panel about women and the big book, and to this day. And it was just brought up this idea that the big book was written for one type of personality type, really, which was from the experience of men who were power drivers. And so many of our early members were salesmen, and they were from the same kind of education, business class, age group, etc. I guess I wanted to ask your thoughts on the big book and whether or not it really can help women and people of color and folks from marginalized groups recover, right? Or if you have any thoughts on our history and our history of underserved populations, marginalized groups, and in AA and recovery in general. I don't know, perhaps Chris, you had talked about Indigenous people and the early sobriety movement there, and perhaps you can speak to that, start us off on that.
I guess, my feeling, as a historian is that, there's always, that the message constantly needs to grow and evolve and broaden. And because, 1935 is a long time ago, and it's certainly, as time has gone by, it has, the message doesn't carry to as many people as need to hear it. But one of the things that I am proud of as being a member of AA is that I think that AA is changing with the times, is coming out with new material for additional groups I think the big book is always going to be an important document. As long as there are, supplementary material to address other audiences and to put the big book in perspective for them, I think, we'll be okay. But there's always going to be, something of a gap, a lag. And so we have to constantly be thinking about what else we can do.
Bob or Bill, feel free to unmute yourself to take a stab.
Okay, I'll take a stab. I think there's a lot of problems with the book today in terms of addressing all kinds of different populations within the alcoholic community. There was a time where I thought we should be rewriting the book, editing the book, and it's just never going to happen. So get over that. But I do think that the book was published in 1939. If we get to 2039, and Alcoholics Anonymous hasn't come up with a new big book, I would suggest we call it "More Has Been Revealed." Like the family afterwards should talk about Al-Anon and things like that, and to the employer should talk about EIP, all kinds of different things that we've learned about since 1939. So yeah, I think I don't think we should be. Nobody's going to be talking about changing the big book. You're not going to get any traction with that in Alcoholics Anonymous. But if we don't publish a new book by 2039, then shame on Alcoholics Anonymous.
Bob, you want to take us out?
Yeah, clearly Bill Wilson was a failed power driver, and he thought he could work his way to success in the business world, and that would make him feel good. And at the peak of his success, he was drinking pretty heavy. So some of the religious roots of AA, pietism and things like this, Trish Travis wrote a very interesting book with a poorly choice title called Language of the Heart. And, she claims AA based on new thought, etc. It's a religious rejection of the world. So it's a rejection of the material, etc., etc. And, I don't think too many of us have gone down that path, but that's the theory. But people that don't fit I take it to talking and trying to help people and say, like, people are reluctant to do a fourth step. So I say, how would you like to have less fear and less resentment? And I think that's a better approach, because whatever my starting point is, less fear and less resentment is probably something good. Thanks.
Okay, I want to thank everyone for being here, and I will take us out. So the meeting is formally wrapping up. Please head over to the Oh My God room for the after party. ICSA 2020 after party will be hosted from David from the We Agnostics group in Kansas City. David is a comedian who will lighten the mood a little bit, and you don't want to miss the debut of the Hank Parker's Blackout Players 30-minute comedy skit entitled "Is a Belief in God's a Requirement for Sobriety in AA?" which David will be introducing. And then after that, you'll meet some of the cast and crew to talk about the making of the skit. And then anyone who wishes can hang around for a while to talk in this room, or we'll be staying open for another hour or so. But again, please help me thank our panel with silent applause. And lastly, I just want to end this meeting with a moment of silence to honor Life J, who was an active and really important member of the free thinkers, atheist agnostics community. I believe he wanted to attend, and he's also been a regular attender of the he attended the AA History Symposium. This is his biography, and Life J. So we'll take a moment for Life, to remember the life of Life J, who is very much missed, and then hang out and head over to the other room. And we'll also unmute and let people. So moment of silence to do with as you wish for Life J. You guys, I will give freedom to unmute. You can unmute yourselves and have a good time. in chat, but head over to the other room. I'll repost it.
Thank you, Jackie.